Pastry is a worthless wimpy loser who worked as a Willy Wonka wannabe and created sugar statues for clout in hopes of becoming culinary royalty someday. This changed when the Lords of Isekai decided otherwise, and during one of his live Hell's Kitchen sessions, he met his end after Statue Kun fell upon him. However, he was later reincarnated as the overpowered son of a poor noble with the power to clap cheeks as a side hobby. His father, Casserole, is a certified Sigma who moved to a foreign land to pursue his Minecraft-inspired dream of becoming a village leader and farmer, only to discover that the land was drier than his ex's pussy. Sorry, I meant puny sense of humor. However, he worked hard and somehow managed to cultivate a farm there. As Pastry grew older, Casserole often taught him how to use his sword better, only for the lousy wimp to never master it and daydream about his beloved sweets instead, earning the title of the family disappointment. During one such session, Casserole's Cinderella sidekick, Fuel, shows up with news that thanks to Pastry's gardening advice, their bean crop has grown fairly well, making Pastry imagine how many snacks he can prepare with that, while his father realizes even a kid half his age is a better farmer than his shitty ass. On the flip side, Fuel explains that a band of thieves is headed their way from the nearby Rates County, which has been unable to contain them. Pastry worries that if they make it to their dirt-poor village, they'll inevitably ravage all the crops they have worked so hard to grow, and turn their already broke ass into a penniless show. Fuel estimates it'll take the bandits 2 months to get to their village, and Casserole decides their only way out of this potential character development arc is to gather their manpower in one place and attack them before getting attacked. He also realizes that they can't ask Count Rates for help, despite them being the reason why they are about to get their ass whooped, simply because they care too much for appearances and would die before getting labeled incompetent losers in the capital. While these two discuss how this attack will potentially bankrupt them, Pastry gets triggered over the dilemma that this attack might ruin all their wheat crops and wipe out his dream of rebooting a real-life chocolate factory by making as many sweets as possible. Fuel notices Pastry's anger and suggests that they use him as their trump card by awakening his innate magic prematurely, and Casserole becomes the father of the century when he agrees to treat his son as a scapegoat. Later, he talks to his wife Agnes about this, and though her motherly instinct kicks in at first and she protests against this idea, once Casserole gaslights her enough, her inner weeb awakens, and she drags Pastry to the paradise of cross-dressing. As she gives him a complete makeover and fangirls over how cute he looks, Pastry internally curses the fate that brought him 5 sisters and a complete freak for a mother. But secretly, he enjoys this side hobby. Later, after Pastry bids farewell to his buddies, Lumi and Mark, Casserole uses his low-budget transport plan and teleports his son to the capital, where Pastry can't help but thirst after the heaps of fruits and sugar he's never seen back in his dead broke shithole of a house. His father agrees to get him whatever he wants once his magic awakening ceremony is over, and Pastry sets his heart eyes on some beautiful, ripe apples, only to learn they are called bonkas in this alternative universe. Seeing him interested in rare fruits makes Casserole's Delulu wonder if his son is actually a political genius, while all Pastry does is fantasize about all the apple desserts he'll be making once he returns home, effortlessly living up to the family disappointment title. Later, the duo finally arrives at the ceremonial church where a shady guy, who looks like he does coke all day, greets them, and is surprised to find that the famous dirt-poor noble has come to his church to perform the magic awakening ceremony of his only son. He agrees to go through with it and straps Pastry in a well-deserved straitjacket before roofing him with a sus drink and leaving him in a dark, empty room. Days pass, and Casserole begins to worry for his safety, while the shady pope does nothing but add to his misery by mentioning how many end up in mental asylums after living through the horrors of being alone in a dark room for days. However, Pastry's dumbass copes with it just fine as he finally gets some time to fantasize about what kinds of sweets he'll make using the apples from the market, and how he'll eventually turn this fantasy land into a dessert land by the end of his power-amping arc. With this, he falls asleep, and when he comes to, Casserole's ugly face greets him instead of some hot babe with a baked cheesecake. Although disappointed about this, Pastry is happy to learn his magic reserves were so immense it took them 2 days to manifest. And he later undergoes another ceremony to finally learn what kind of magic he has. Upon realizing he can perform the rare and broken replication magic, Pastry finally learns the wonders of plot armor firsthand, while Casserole believes his puny ass and broke village can finally be saved. As he later bids farewell to the Pope, Casserole tries to shut his fat mouth with a bag full of silver coins, an amount the greedy bastard later deems inadequate, and swears to sing about Pastry's legendary prowess like a tone-deaf bit. Soon enough. Meanwhile, Casserole buys Pastry a bag full of apples, and the two of them share the best ones together, promising each other not to tell Agnes about this when they return home. A few days later, as the Homelander wannabes ravage through a nearby town and complain about the lack of babes and beef to feed them all, their shithead leader suggests they head to Casserole's village, assuming that it must be rich in terms of both. Meanwhile, Fuel breaks this news to Casserole, and they almost shit their pants upon calculating that the bandits may be arriving sooner than they previously anticipated. To counter this, Casserole asks his personal mailman to break this news to his fellow villagers just so they can hurry up with their countermeasure. According to their plan, they stuff the water supply in 2 out of their 3 villages with mud and store the crops in their safe houses, hoping to starve the bandits when they get there and force them to focus all their manpower toward the one village where Casserole will be ready to attack with his army of wimps and losers. Even Pastry, after using his half-a-brain cell, knows full well that his father's so-called toy soldiers would never hold up against the upcoming threat, and he realizes they need to come up with a better plan. Right then, his scrawny lackeys show up and try their best to embarrass Pastry by licking his boots to guarantee their future promotion, only for the sugar-obsessed dude to put them to good use. He tells them to collect as many rocks as possible since that's all they can manage with their rotten brains. Bruh. And the stupid chipmunks immediately get down to it. While picking up this garbage, Mark's Delulu claims he's way better than Pastry in terms of muscle power, just so he can impress Lumi, his self-proclaimed chick. However, she puts him in his place by simping for Pastry instead and telling him he's just a worthless side character. Right then, their couple's fight gets interrupted by approaching hoofbeats, and although Lumi claims he needs to take some pills because he's hallucinating, Mark grabs her and runs up to the MC, seeking his plot armor to save his nuts. Mark's father, who looks like a part-time Calvin Klein model, immediately shuts the doors to their village. However, all the overnight soldiers instantly get wobbly legs, being the cowards they are, until Casserole steps in with his talk no jutsu and inspires them to quit being scaredy shitheads. Following this, Fuel proposes that they let these weaklings rest for the night, assuming that the bandits will prefer to strike at dawn. He explains that since they aren't familiar with their territory and don't possess magic eyes, they would make use of the sun. However, Casserole believes their growling stomachs and empty pockets will force them to attack them like hungry wolves, even at midnight. Their clashing opinions make them turn to the wisest man among them, who uses his dimwit to conclude that they need more info before they can come to a decision. To feed his imagination, Casserole heads out to play the sacrificial hero and drags Fuel into the shithole with him, while Pastry finally becomes the big boss in his absence and instantly starts bossing people around like some corporate leech, recalling that his father has enough riz as a side character to dodge surprise attacks. He plans to smoke his cocky ass by firing fire-lit arrows at him as soon as they hear the enemy approaching and sets his friend's own chick, Lumi, to the task. Meanwhile, Fuel uses his 3rd grade Baikugan to get an X-ray view of the bandits before him and Casserole, only to realize they aren't some broke-ass wannabe squad, but a professional group of thieves. While the head of the thieves plays Sherlock by stating the obvious and explains to his stupid underlings that their enemy is luring them to their HQ on purpose, Casserole takes his first strike at them and injures many of his men. Instead of counter-attacking, the leader simps after his basic battle plans until Casserole runs out of riz and rides back to his village, followed closely by the remaining bandits. It turns out that this was the Giga Chad's plan all along, so as soon as those dumbasses get closer to the village, they get smoked by the fiery arrows planned by Pastry's elementary school battle tactics. To top it all off, Pastry uses his toddler squad to slingshot rocks at the bandits, which, thanks to plot armor and the power of never giving up, end up wiping more than half of trained, blood-lusting criminals. This doesn't sit right with the gang leader, and he uses his small, puny dagger to jump right into the villagers' territory despite a few wimps and an idiotic Baldy trying to hold him back. He then shows them who's the real boss by condemning many of the good guys to hell and eventually stoops low enough to come at the real root of the problem: the annoying ass village children. deciding that there's enough bitching and moaning in the world without them. The leader almost slits them open, only for Pastry to use the power of the make to get in the way. The bandit uses this dumb move against Pastry and makes him his hostage instead, only for him to use his replication magic to reflect the pain of one man's burned scars onto the other thieves. This causes the previously badass dude to whimper like a baby in pain until Mark finishes him off by throwing a final rock at his empty head and officially putting him out of business. The next morning, when the news about the mama boy's injury breaks, Agnes throws a hysteric tantrum, only to be consoled once she learns the injury wasn't too grave. Meanwhile, an alive and well Pastry continues his journey to become the village's Riz King and distributes rations among his dirt-poor villagers. Meanwhile, Casserole captivates the thieves in a barn since his broke ass can't afford a prison cell just yet. And plans to send them off to Retest County so that those slackers can save face and throw him some money for compensation. He later distributes measly pennies from his shitty budget to the villagers in exchange for their services, including Mark and Lumi, who are more than moved to receive some hand-me-downs and a bag of grains way past its best before date. With Pastry's help, the two take this back to Mark's house for clout, and he wins both the Best Brother award and a feel of his mommy's love. Once he's established as his house's local hero, they move to Lumi's residence, where her grandfather's stinky beard greets her, and they all end up enjoying an drinking party. While the booze makes Pastry fantasize about his journey to diabetes, Lumi and Mark sneak out and head to the makeshift prison barn, hoping to meet with the thieves now that they are literal heroes, only for their Nepo card to decline right away. However, Mark later uses his dirty tactics to distract the prison guards and sneak them both in. Once inside, they laugh at the now miserable tough guys from yesterday, only for Mark's second-hand sword to get the leader's attention. He reveals that it belonged to him until yesterday, and once he smells Mark's greedy tendencies from afar, he offers to help teach him how to use magic with it. Despite Lumi warning him about how sus the shady guy is, nothing stops Mark's newfound shortcut to attaining god-tier powers, only for his dimwit to be kicked in the nuts by the thief, who immediately breaks free and gets hold of his sword. Lumi's woman card doesn't work against this Satanist either, and he stabs her before fleeing with Mark as his hostage. Seeing that the big boss is escaping, his underlings demand to be freed too, only to be called useless pushovers by him right before he runs away on a stolen horse. As soon as this tea reaches Pastry, he rushes to Lumi's side, and after making sure she's safe, he follows after the thief on horseback. On his way, he wonders if he can use his protagonist privilege to force a draw against the thug and puts his faith in the traps he previously set in the forest. Meanwhile, this news reaches Casserole, and he immediately heads out to save his problem child, only for Fuel to get in his way by spouting some bullshit about politics and how a runaway criminal will taint their oh-so-good public image. On the other hand, Mark tries to use his tone-deaf loud mouth against the thief, which surprisingly works after tangling them within a mousetrap. With the mouse down, Pastry arrives at the spot with his ninja art of perfect timing and pulls his sword at him. As their duel begins, Pastry realizes he's as good as smoked if he doesn't run away, but decides to use a cliched speech about how he'd never abandon his friend to amp his flimsy ass. Hours later, Fuel looks for Pastry in the forest, but discovers nothing except his broken sword. Assuming that he's dead, the Cinderella man returns home with tears in his eyes, only to discover Pastry is safe and sound. Casserole doesn't get how his loser son managed to pull something like this either and demands an explanation, only for the brat to state they won't be able to understand it with their low IQ, even if he does explain it.
What did he say?
Eventually, he gives up and reveals he used his replication magic to copy Casserole's teleportation at the last minute, only for the jealous father to pep talk him into never using this literal ass pull in front of anyone ever again, especially on the battlefield. Later, he talks to his useless henchmen about how much all the gold diggers around them would try to use Pastry as a war weapon if the news about his overpowered ability ever gets out. The following day, while Mark wallows in how much of a weakling he is, Pastry shows up and suggests they visit Lumi now that she isn't dying. However, Mark begins to cry instead, blaming himself for almost getting her unalived. Pastry, who is extremely tired of his drama queen sob fests, tells him crying like a little bit won't solve his problems, and that if he really wants to clap her skinny peaches, he will need to man up, as he later drags him to Lumi's house. Pastry excuses himself from becoming a third wheeler and hides his single ass in the kitchen with his one true love, desserts. While he turns life's lemons into a sweet lemon and apple pie, Mark bows his head before Lumi and begs for her forgiveness, asking whether she'd still let him bang her after all that's happened. Just as she wonders what to answer him, Pastry returns as a professional blocker with his sweet pie and offers them both a piece. As they forget all about their injuries and failures, Pastry goes on with his crap about how different apples can be used to make different desserts. Just like all humans have different roles. He says he'd still recruit Mark in his future army, despite him being a complete and utter failure, which moves him to tears about finally landing a job interview. Right then, Lumi's father enters the picture with his sharing inactivated and tells Mark he will have to marry his daughter now that he has given her an ugly scar. Lumi instantly agrees, knowing full well she can't land a man with her non-existent melons, while Mark turns as red as a tomato from the embarrassment. As everyone later enjoys the apple pie together, Pastry realizes he is one step closer to his dream of creating Diabetes Land, and he swears to make everyone happy once he's achieved his goal. The next morning, however, the corporate crisis hit Pastry's dreamland again as Casserole complains about his flat broke bank account and the lack of funding to restart their life. Fuel further adds to his misery by reminding him that they are known far and wide as legendary frauds, which is why they can't expect to get loans either. Just as he curses the runaway thief leader, Pastry asks if he can ask his or his wife's parents for money, only to learn his father's shitness doesn't stop at being an awful leader, but he's also been a model son by cutting all ties with his parents when they refuse to let him marry Agnes. Although his parents' love life doesn't interest Pastry in the least, Casserole boasts how he ran away with Agnes, and she basically lost all her wealth to a deadbeat guy's Riz. Later, as he shares this tea with his two friends, they pay no heed to him and instead flirt with each other, making him realize he's been promoted to the third wheel pedestal. Either way, since he needs their 2 brain cells, he stays and asks for some ideas to become an overnight billionaire. Lumi advises him to start an apple pie business, and although Pastry is smitten with the idea, he still needs to pull his broke ass out of the gutter before he can afford apples. Mark suggests he teach magic, but Pastry knows better than to become an underpaid teacher to a bunch of dimwits. Lumi adds fuel to the fire by calling Mark an idiot who'd set fire to himself before he learns to use fire magic, making Pastry feel sick of their couple fights. Next up, they suggest he uses his replication magic to become a tattoo artist, an idea that actually intrigues him. Excited to become the next big emo band, Mark and Lumi draw up some sketches for their future tattoos, only for Lumi to poke fun at Mark's lack of artistic talent and the ugly dragon that he draws. Pissed off, he tells her to wait till he shows her his dragon.
Wait a minute!
Only for Pastry to butt in and use a spell to copy the sketches onto their hands. Both of them instantly fall in love with how well the tattoos look, and Lumi wonders if he would be able to copy and paste something else besides sketches if he tried. With this, an idea finally lights up in Pastry's dumb brain, and he calls Lumi a big genius, instantly rizzing her up. Quickly, he rushes to his parents and reminds Casserole how he uses his teleportation to take Josephine, Pastry's sister, to balls and parties so she can bag a rich Chad for a husband now that she's of age. He asks what parents who don't possess such overpowered hacks do, and Agnes states they obviously spend tons of money on traveling. That's when Pastry reveals his newest idea and uses replication to paint a portrait of Agnes, suggesting that they pitch these portraits to nobles as a cheap way to arrange marriages. Casserole, whose lack of intelligence has been unable to produce a better idea yet, loves the idea and begins to fantasize about the day he'd finally make millions at his son's expense. Meanwhile, Agnes asks Pastry to Photoshop her wrinkly skin to look less old, making him sigh in annoyance. With this cool weapon in their arsenal, Casserole and Pastry head to Rites County to finally hold a meeting with the bitch responsible for their currently broke ass and misery. Right off the bat, Casserole tries to rizz her up, only for her to shift all her attention to Pastry instead, who is stunned to see how ugly she looks with her horrible case of hair dye. They later get settled around a tea table where Pastry is surprised to see all the desserts he once loved back in the old world. And though Casserole tries his hardest to butter the Countess up by singing false praises of this mediocre supper, Pastry makes it very clear that it doesn't appeal to his superior palate. This throws off the Countess, who wants nothing more than to impress him, but gets distracted when Casserole yaps about agriculture and some other bullshit he usually does. Upon finally getting Rites's attention, he places all the credit onto Pastry, saying how his useless self couldn't have grown his crops without his son's help. Using this chance, Pastry mentions how some bandits came and destroyed all their hard-earned livelihood just a few days ago and subtly threatens the Countess he'd be handing them over to the royal army so they can lead an investigation into where they came from. Knowing full well it was her own county, Rites realizes she's as good as smoked. However, she still tries to lie her way out and challenges them to find proof that it was her army's incompetence. As if this was the moment he lived his whole life for. Casserole instantly pulls out his trump card, a sword with the Rites emblem that one of the bandits was carrying, giving her the proof she was begging for. Now completely cornered, she offers to compensate for the damages. And after some bargaining, Pastry finally milks out 150 gold coins, a deal that thoroughly satisfies him but pisses off the Countess, who realizes Casserole wasn't bluffing when he credited Pastry for whatever measly success he has. Later, as this queen of plots bids Pastry farewell, she asks him why he seemed like he didn't like the tea they served, only for Pastry to yap on and on about how the cookies served together with it were too sweet and could be improved in the future. When Casserole's ears begin to bleed from it, he slaps his head and apologizes to the hot babe for causing her trouble. Pastry himself apologizes to her with a replicated painting of her, which the Countess soon becomes obsessed with. The next day, Casserole takes another business trip to the mansion of Duke Cattlesec on the occasion of his grandson's coming-of-age ceremony. His grandson, Squall, who looks more like a Mrs., seems high on a few hundred espresso shots and greets Casserole while stuttering. Cattlesec tells him to loosen his pants and reveals that he practically worships Casserole's tales of valor, making him flustered at this newfound celebrity status. Once all is said and done, Cattlesec finally pays attention to Pastry's insignificant existence, only to be impressed by his try-hard ass. In fact, when his own grandson chickens out before Pastry, Cattlesec almost gives him up for adoption in exchange for owning Pastry. The pick-me dude, on the other hand, continues to impress the Duke even further by painting him a picture of a hot baddie with huge melons while demonstrating his newly learned magic. However, before the stinky, old man gets carried away, Pastry explains that it's a gift to Squall from the military commander Hubert, who sent his daughter's portrait to him since he couldn't visit them himself. The reason behind that is the constant threats of war that his territory is surrounded with, which makes it dangerous for his daughter Petra to leave their mansion. Squall, on the other hand, barely listens to any of this as his virgin ass, who has never once seen a woman before, just like all of you losers, falls in love at first sight and instantly agrees to pay her a visit the following month. Cattlesec, on the other hand, feels annoyed at his grandson's dimwit as he realizes how the father-son tag team is trying to arrange a marriage between the two households, something that he doesn't want. To block his own grandson, Cattlesec tries to turn down the offer by mentioning the cost of travel and their currently flat broke bank accounts, only for Casserole to volunteer to become his personal cost-free ride. Just as the old man fumes in annoyance after hearing this, Pastry sucks up to him by revealing that Hubert is actually seeking a family tie with him so he can draw out the threats surrounding him using Cattlesec's awesome army to threaten his opponent. The praise junkie gets instantly flattered and announces to the audience that he'd be visiting Hubert's residence personally, along with his grandson, soon enough. Later, after succeeding in his sneaky mission, Pastry idles around at the party when Squall's lousy self greets him and asks if there's something Petra likes in particular. As the dumb virgin begins to yap about the sweet cookies she likes and how he can help him make some, Squall realizes he's too young to understand his question, and instead asks him to alter Petra's portrait to enhance her plots and make her more sexy, causing Pastry to roll his eyes. That evening, Fuel simps after Casserole for being a generous man and asks him to raise his pay, only for Pastry to interrupt them. The loser brings them 2 letters, one from the Cattlesec household and the other from Hubert, according to which Petra and Squall have been engaged, and for playing the matchmaker, Casserole's state receives a hefty sum of money, just as Pastry wonders if he can finally buy the precious apples he's always been too moneyless to afford. Casserole says they aren't getting free charity, but will have to provide their services to ensure Petra's safety when she travels from her hometown to the capital. It's because her shithead father has beef with almost everyone in his vicinity, and they might try to harm Petra to even their score with him. Fuel wonders if he can just transport her with his handy-dandy magic. But Casserole says they can't because for that, they'll have to station some soldiers in the capital first, for which they don't have enough time. Hearing this, Fuel suggests they turn down the job, but Casserole instantly explains to him how they'll never make this much money in their entire careers ever again if they don't take this job. Pastry agrees with him too, since he needs the pennies to establish his diabetes land. As he forces his 2 brain cells to ponder over the situation, he comes up with the master plan to take Petra to the church in the name of her magic awakening ceremony and keep her in the sanctuary for 2 days until her engagement with the pansy prince is officially announced. Casserole instantly accepts this since his dumbass can't come up with a better plan, and Pastry tries to sneak out, hoping for this idea to serve as leverage against the money he has stolen from the prize. However, even though his father is completely retarded when it comes to other stuff, he doesn't fuck around when it comes to dollar bills and instantly smacks his smart ass when he finds out about the apples and sugar he has ordered. The next day, as the father and son head to the Huberk residence to escort Petra, Pastry finds that he won't just be around one baddie this whole time, but 2 since Petra has a twin sister. The hot babe instantly starts flattering Pastry in hopes of receiving more of his sweet, nutty cookies. But this loser turns her off by yapping about the quality of flour instead. Once inside the carriage, Pastry tries his luck with Licorice, the edgy twin sister instead, only for her to pay no heed to him either. Petra lectures her to be more upfront if she wants to get her cheeks clapped, especially with her non-existent plots. But the gloomy bitch only wallows in how Pastry only paid attention to her when Petra ignored his yapping. Soon enough, Casserole and Huberk get on the carriage too and head to the church, only to be followed by a bunch of wannabe Jason Bournes, waiting to pull the plot twist of the century. However, as soon as Casserole gets off the carriage, he smells their stinky ass from afar and gives them a good beating. A thug escapes his god eyes and pulls up in front of the damsels in distress, only for Pastry to show him who the top dog is and beat him to a pulp. Once all the ass are as good as whooped, the group heads inside the church, where Licorice's pick-me-ass gets abandoned by Petra, who can't wait to get laid by Squall. However, Pastry uses this chance to rizz her up with his 0 charm, only for the dumb chick to fall head over heels in love with him. Seeing how he isn't paying attention to her sister, unlike everyone else, this jealous chick regrets ignoring him before and decides to treat him better from now on. Later, the group heads to a shady dark to perform some witchcraft that instantly teleports them from this local church to the one in the capital. Meanwhile, some wannabe who looks like Michael Jackson on crack,
"You're a victim!"
calls up some money-lusting freaks and tells them to kidnap a woman for 10 gold coins. This jobless guy is the head of the fallen House Armire and tells his underling to capture Petra before her engagement with the Cattlesec household is announced. This chubby Mario tells the twig to quit bossing him around and heads out on his mission, only for his minions to question why the ex-duke is trying so hard to win his noble status back. Mario explains that this salty idiot either wants to embarrass the Cattlesec household by kidnapping their heir's bride or marry the kidnapped bride to reclaim his lost nobility status after the damsel falls under Stockholm Syndrome. Either way, all he cares about is the money, so he balls. Back at the church, Petra feels like dying from the lack of attention and whines about how she cannot wait to finally meet Squall, after thirsting for his portrait for days on end. Pastry, who is proud of his matchmaking skills, compares it to making desserts until his father breaks him out of his daydream and reminds him he's at work. After Fuel makes his comeback, Casserole explains to Pastry that while Petra will be in the sanctuary, he will have to take Licorice to the guest room and help her relax, making Fuel tease him about how it's time for him to lose his V-card, while Casserole reprimands him for filling his innocent son's head with dirty ideas. The innocent son rizzes up the rich girl and takes her to the guest room, only for all his plans to go down the drain when her constipated maid becomes the third wheel. Meanwhile, the crackhead Michael Jackson drinks up some wine as he imagines the end of the Cattlesec and Petra heads to the royal castle with her father, once her ceremony completes. On the other hand, while Pastry tries to find excuses to shake off the ugly bitch from keeping him from Licorice, a magic hole appears right under their feet, and both Pastry and Licorice fall into it. Even Casserole's heroic entry into the room or the stuck-up maid's tears fail to save them. Fuel suspects that the use of magic is behind this, and after ordering him to inform the Cattlesec household about this, Casserole jumps right into the hole, refusing to let his golden goose fall into someone else's clutches. Soon enough, Pastry wakes up in a dark, gloomy room with a tied-up Licorice right next to him, making him wonder whose sadistic foreplay they both have fallen into. Right then, the culprit greets him good morning, only for Pastry to ask him why he has kidnapped them. Obviously, the kidnapper doesn't reveal shit, and Pastry is left to his own devices, pondering when in the world he became so important that professionals would kidnap him. That's when he realizes it's Licorice they are after, and since he's still just as insignificant as ever, one wrong move might just wipe him out. To confirm his suspicions, the evil Mario also warns him about acting funny before leaving his understudy to keep an eye on them. While Casserole finally makes it through the never-ending hole, Licorice wakes up too and, upon seeing Pastry lying next to her, assumes that she's finally clapped. However, Pastry's dimwit quickly bursts her bubble, explaining that they've been kidnapped and that she doesn't need to worry as long as he's there with his impenetrable plot armor. Mario's shitty sidekick tells Pastry to quit acting like a tough nut since he's about to be cracked anyway. And the sugar-obsessed dude presumes this one's likely just a loudmouth, and that the fat Mario is the only one who can use magic. With this, he plays the role of a mama's boy in distress and sheds crocodile tears to make the shithead believe he's a noble kid in exchange for whom they can receive over 200 gold coins. His greedy ears quickly perk up, and he warns Pastry about spouting bullshit. But he insists that if the kidnapper is also a noble, they can definitely receive a hefty sum through a negotiation. The wannabe gangster confirms Pastry's suspicions with his twisted face, and Pastry deduces that the one behind this kidnapping is the Duke of Armire, judging from the trashy condition of his place and the feud he had with the Cattlesecs about 10 years ago. To convey this info to his useless father, he engraves it on his robes and sends it to him. On the other hand, Casserole receives news that Licorice's shitty father isn't dispatching any soldier for her rescue since he's too busy licking Cattlesec's boots using his other daughter, much to everyone's disappointment. To add to Casserole's distress, the useless maid begins to lecture him on parenthood, almost as if he doesn't give two shits about Pastry's disappearance, only to receive a shut-up call from his right-hand man. Just then, Pastry's ribbon flies up to them, and after learning that Armire's pansy ass is the one behind all of this drama, Casserole transports fuel to the capital and heads out to get to Pastry on his own. Meanwhile, the evil Mario returns, fuming with anger upon being scammed into kidnapping the wrong sister, and almost beats the crap out of Licorice. However, Pastry plays her knight in shining armor to increase his chances of getting laid and receives the beating in her place. With him down, the dumb kidnapper pulls his sword out to finish Licorice, only for her to summon Pastry with the power of tears, who warns the kidnapper about laying his hands on his chick once more. Now cornered, he calculates how powerful Pastry might be to take out his subordinate and sabotage his attack all at once. Seeing retreat as his only option, the coward tries to run, only for Casserole to block his exit as he rushes in for help.
Surprise, motherfucker!
With his daddy on board, Pastry tells evil Mario that he has no way left to run, only for him to smirk and put his useless quirk to use by digging yet another hole and escaping through it. After learning where there's a hole, there's a way. The hard way, a disappointed Pastry reunites with his father and potential future wife, just as Fuel walks in with yet another pair of weaklings. To add to Pastry's distress, one of these bastards grabs Licorice and leaves, citing how he'll be returning her to her deadbeat father. Fuel later reveals that they've captured Armire, and Casserole explains how this guy was stripped of his title some 20 years ago after he was found to be a military rat, passing information to the enemy. Just then, Cattlesec's minions show up and ask for Casserole to submit a report about the incident, which he pushes onto poor Fuel before escaping with Pastry to look for the runaway thug. Soon afterward, as they step back into the rundown mansion, Pastry finally uses his dimwit to realize the Humpty Dumpty never had enough magic energy to escape the vicinity, simply because he's a weakling in a thug's clothing. With this, they return to the room at once, only to realize that he was biding his time, hiding inside his hole this whole time. With the father, the son, and the sorry thug in the same room, the thug praises Pastry for seeing through his weak-ass plan and grabs his sword to finish off both of them. To make things far easier for him, Pastry volunteers to fight a one-on-one match. Evil Mario grins and swings at him, hoping to finish him off in one move, only for his sword to break in two. As Pastry slaps this patron saint of sucking big time, Casserole captures him and thanks heavens for not giving Pastry his dumb genes upon learning that this Sherlock junkie replicated cracks onto their opponent's sword to win their fight. 1 month later, as Squall and Petra become legal buddies, Pastry attends their wedding and asks Duke Casserole if he was the one who fed the kidnappers with false information about the girl's appearance and instigated Lycoris's kidnapping just so he could wipe out the threat he felt from the resurrection of the Armire household. Although the Duke refuses to accept this, he turns out to be the real rat in this entire situation, and Pastry uses this to milk more money out of him after he threatens to reveal this information to Duke Hubert by mistake. The outsmarted dumbass agrees to help and acknowledges his mistake after cursing Pastry's cunning and conspiring act. Right then, the joke of a father, Duke Hubert, shows up and thanks Pastry for cleaning up after his mess. He further goes on to ask his dumbass if he has a woman he's interested in yet, making him wonder why a middle-aged dude is interested in his non-existent love life. As he gets the creeps, Pastry explains how he's far too young for any of this for now, only for the Duke to propose that he gets engaged to Lycoris before another woman butts in and snatches him away. As all the other adults internally die from secondhand embarrassment, Pastry's people-pleasing tendencies make it hard to turn him down, though he still tries to play the "she deserves better" card. Hubert asks if it's because his daughter is deficient in some way, and though Pastry wants to mention the lack of juice in her melons, he stays quiet to protect his second chance at life. Even his greedy father agrees to this proposal, and Casserole too gets on the bandwagon to enjoy Pastry's instant karma, making him lose all faith in humanity. Eventually, even Lycoris shows up to greet him and thanks him for saving her the other day, only for Pastry to become instantly smitten with her for some reason. When this news reaches Squall and Petra, they propose to go three-way with him someday, an offer he nervously turns down. Eventually, all of this boot-licking tires him out, and Pastry enjoys some solitude in the evening, but only for Lycoris to ruin that too. This attention-seeking bitch wonders if Pastry isn't happy with her, only for him to reassure her that he is. Relieved to hear this, she tries to win him over with his beloved sweet cookies, only for Pastry to realize she added salt into them in place of sugar. Still, being the good husband that he is, he devours it all and even praises her, making her smile wholeheartedly. As the sun goes down and he eats more of her culinary failure, Pastry vows to himself that he'll protect her for the rest of his life. Once the party is over, Casserole faces his worst nightmare and stands before Agnes with his Jell-O legs, explaining how their family now has a new daughter, who is pretty and belongs to a noble family. Agnes misunderstands and assumes it's Casserole who's been clapping some rich chick behind her back and throws a tantrum, only to realize how wrong she is when he mentions Pastry's engagement. As she reels from the embarrassment, Casserole decides to sneak out with Pastry to save his ass, without knowing that Agnes has entered fangirl mode over getting yet another daughter to dress up and bull. Meanwhile, Rites receives news about Pastry's engagement and loses her composure upon losing him to some plotless chick, after she literally burns herself and offers fanservice while cleaning herself up. She learns she's the daughter of the Hubert family and deduces that the cunning fox Hubert set this up so he could make use of Pastry's many talents. Her attendant believes she's spouting bullshit, only for Rites to explain how Casserole was broke as shit before Pastry entered the picture and suddenly turned his barren lands into money-making machines. She calculates that the land will prosper even more as long as Pastry has plot armor in his arsenal and assumes that Hubert must have smelled this from afar. Meanwhile, this world-class threat rejoices in the new supplies he has milked from blackmailing Casserole. Just then, his ever-starving friends enter the picture, only to discover he has trees, not apple pies, hiding in all the boxes. Lumi asks if he plans on feeding them tree pies, only to learn that since trees are for planting, that's what they'll do. It makes them wonder if he has finally deviated from his dream of getting diabetes, only to learn he wants to use these trees to attract honeybees and produce honey. Both his underlings support this, but Pastry mentions that they cannot pull this stunt just yet since their territory is drier than the Sahara. To solve this issue, he switches careers once again and plans to create water reservoirs, exactly like they do in mountainous areas. Meanwhile, Casserole and Fuel count the pennies they have saved this year, only to realize they have made a tiny profit after 20 years of staying world-class failures. Casserole praises his God-sent son for this blessing and humbles his ego to thank Fuel for sticking around with somebody as useless as him. Hearing this, Fuel tells him it's too early to celebrate since their new village is still under development and over 40 people are on their way to inhabit it. To add even more stress to his caffeinated ass, he informs him how his so-called blessing is on his way to the new village with his crime partners to create yet another problem for him. Hearing this, as Casserole curses the day he made Pastry, the problem child becomes Saitama with hair and punches a hole through the mountains, copying evil Mario's magic. As the One Punch Man transition gets to his crackhead, Pastry begins to treat the mountains as his punching bag until he successfully scoops out a water reservoir. He later explains how once it rains, this ditch will hold water for them and replenish the trees they'll plant around the edges. With this, he gets carried away into his daydreams and imagines just how quickly he'll establish his sugar land, only for Mark to burst his bubble and bring his attention to an angry Casserole who is ready to smoke his ass with some pirated Chidori. At the same time, the queen of plot cannons throws a tantrum about neither being young enough to clap Pastry without getting arrested, nor having a daughter she could sell away in some political wedlock. As she gets drunk on more and more tea, Rites finally concludes that age is just a number, FBI, open up! And that she has to squeeze into the picture somehow. A few days later, once Pastry has created a working waterway for the new village and earned the top celebrity status, a letter arrives for him, which his sister assumes is from his fiancée. He gets his hopes up only to be thrown off by Ritessa's handwriting as she invites him to a tea party, making him wonder why she's suddenly pulling such a sus move. He later brings his cocky ass back home to bully Fuel and learns that his nomad father is off to the capital once again. However, just as he begins to explain the fishy situation to Fuel in his stead, Casserole shows up like some ghost and tells him to stop worrying about women who would get him in jail and focus on the ones that'll make him rich, for example, his very own fiancée. As Licorice shows up out of the blue, Pastry learns from Casserole that she'll be staying with them for a while, making him wonder if he'll finally get to clap some peaches. In response, Licorice only gives him a sus look that makes his ass tingle for some reason. Rumors about Pastry's fiancé spread like wildfire, to the point that Lumi begins to imagine an older, mature, and curvy woman who has Pastry wrapped around her finger, exactly the opposite of reality. On the other hand, the loser brings her to his secret heaven, which isn't his bedroom, but the kitchen where he bakes his beloved sweets. Meanwhile, Hubert's underling asks why he has sent his daughter away to Casserole's dirt-poor village, even when she hasn't officially been engaged to Pastry yet. The cunning schemer explains he did it to block whatever tactics the bitchy plot queen is using to get to Pastry. Now that she has invited him to this cover-up, she calls a tea party. Additionally, since he suspects war is about to break with their neighbors, the Luterat household, he has used whatever was left of his fatherly love to send her off for her safety. Back in the village, Licorice simps after Pastry's kitchen in hopes of winning him over and pesters him about what he's making, only to learn that he's preparing something for the Countess. Eventually, after asking dumb questions about whether sugar is sugar and apples are apples, Licorice gets him to explain how broke they are to afford even a kilo of apples, and how he had to give up on his allowance to feed a woman he isn't even going to clap. Later, as Pastry is done with his sugary syrup, he spreads it on a sheet tray, making Licorice wonder why he's spreading this so happily and not her legs. Eventually, as the syrup hardens, Pastry shows his elementary school artistic skills and pokes shapes into it, rizzing up Licorice with measly cats, dogs, and rabbits. It works since, like every damsel in distress, she's happy with the bare minimum and can't help but thirst after how innocent and happy Pastry looks while focused. On the other hand, while Pastry refuses to step into adulthood with Licorice, his mother, sister, and friends, who are playing professional spies from behind the doors, feel more and more frustrated at how dumb he is for not using this golden opportunity to get laid. Pastry, on the other hand, prepares candy apples for Licorice to suck on since it's far too early for her to try his eggplant. Once he's established she isn't ready yet, Pastry heads out to bring in his friends for a taste test, only to discover they've been spying on him for Lord knows how long. Josephine and Agnes instantly flee from the scene, leaving Mark and Lumi to face Pastry's wrath. However, all this weakling manages is to keep them from tasting his apples. A few days later, D-Day arrives, and while Pastry imagines how he'll save the sinking economy by selling all of Ritessa's expensive furniture, Lycoris's constipated maid lectures him about how he needs to focus more on Lycoris's boring ass than sweets and money. This only backfires as he instead turns to Ritessa's hot portrait, wondering why she has blatantly put it on display. Right then, the Countess's rat comes up to Pastry and greets him, sending him subtle threats about how he should behave himself. However, it works since all he was going to do today was promote his new business. He uses Lycoris's noble status to get all the attention he needs for that and shows off his jar full of hard candy. Stupid nobles who have never seen such a wonder before get instantly sold, including the rat from before who thought he was some alpha badass. Once everyone gets high on sugar, Pastry tries to bribe them into reducing tax prices on sugary goods in exchange for receiving these candies for free, only for Ritessa to show up at the worst possible time and wreck his scheme. This babe, with her juicy melons, instantly gets everyone's attention to the point that jealous Lycoris feels the need to introduce herself to her in hopes of threatening her to stay away from her man. However, her flimsy man can't take his eyes off of the Queen of Plots and instantly follows after her when she asks for a private audience. Once the two of them are alone, Pastry mentions how on guard she looks, making Ritessa explain it's because she's a frail woman in a magic user's company. Pastry doesn't understand how, especially since she has enough meat in all the right places, but shrugs it off and gets down to business. He starts by winning her over by exploiting her sweet tooth and later reveals that he plans on growing the raw material for these sweets, sugar, and honey in his village. Ritessa refuses to believe he can do it on such a barren land. But knowing how well his plot armor works, she fears that he just might. The cunning bitch then plans to steal whatever greater future he's planning and agrees to help him with his endeavor, making Pastry's dumb bat feel ever grateful to her. On the other hand, as Pastry becomes the talk of the town, Lycoris begins to feel jealous as her paranoid ass imagines what he might be doing with a chick as hot as Ritessa. Compared to her flat is Justice's approach to life. As her social anxiety kicks in, Lycoris heads out of the hall to head back to her safe space. Meanwhile, as he fantasizes about making more and more money from his candies, Ritessa asks Pastry about Lycoris and how he rescued her from her kidnapper. She wonders if he loves her, and though Pastry turns red as a tomato, he's too much of a pansy to admit it. This gives her an opening, and she uses it to hug Pastry from behind, pressing her melons against him and telling him she won't release him until he admits his feelings for Lycoris. Pastry, who has never felt a chick this up close, loses all his alpha energy and begins to give in, only for Lycoris to walk in on them at the very last moment, giving Ritessa's dirty scheme an instant success. Just as soon as Pastry realizes he has messed up his chance to get laid and get rich, he rushes after Lycoris, whose broken heart forces her to flee. Her stuck-up maid tries to question Pastry just how in the world he landed such a hot chick with his absolutely basic riz, but he tells the pity old hag to shut up and runs after Lycoris. He finds her crying to herself in the garden and attempts to apologize, only for her to pass the most gaslighted bitch test and whine about how she isn't good enough for him and understands why he'd choose Ritessa's hot assets over her flat board. She further cries and compares her lousy self to her beautiful and confident sister and feels even more shitty, only for Pastry to pull his talk no jutsu card and tell her he likes her just the way she is. Almost as if he wasn't cuddling with another chick just moments ago, he asks her to trust him. And being the dumb bat he is, Lycoris nods her head. Now, to bring her smile back to her face, Pastry teleports back home while everyone else worries about his sinking love life for him. He returns after a bit, and just when Lycoris expects him to pull out a bouquet, he shows up with another one of his candied apples, explaining how he made this one just for her since it has a little heart carved on it.
Stop the cap!
Already tired of his obsession with sugar, she gives up and takes a bite, only to be reminded of their first time together in the kitchen. This moves her to tears, and upon seeing this, Pastry explains to her how candy apples are also called apples of love, which is why he has used this to pour all of his love into. Just as she wonders if a sugar-coated apple and some sugar-coated bullshit about love should be enough to forgive cheating, Pastry rizzes her up and asks her to trust him once again. Lost to this riz god, she forgives him and thanks him for the treat. However, just as Pastry takes his cue and furthers their plot development, the stuck-up maid gets in their way and takes Lycoris away. Left alone in the new recruit, Nicolo's company, Pastry gets embarrassed as he teases him about his lady killer persona and eventually activates his second-rate Susanoo, threatening Niccolo about doubling his workload on top of his measly paycheck if word ever gets out. Upon returning home, Pastry instantly gets attacked by his mother, who teases him about how hard he's working to clap Lycoris's noble peaches. She momentarily lets him out of her sumo wrestler grip when Lycoris shows up, only to grab him and run away once the gossip queen realizes he must have brought plenty of spicy tea from the literal tea party. After she wears him out to the bone, Fuel helps him recover with yet another cup of tea and finds that Pastry has prepared special-grade wrapping papers to ship his beloved candies in an attempt to get back at Rites for sabotaging his pathway to becoming a rich nobleman. When Rites hears of this, she throws a hysteric tantrum and whines about the newest rumor about how she likes them young. Her useless as shit advisor doesn't help either as he skims through her recent marriage proposals, most of whom come from 10-year-olds. On the other hand, Hubert's advisor, who looks like a Greek god, informs him of Luderout's 30,000 men army and how he'll be striking before they officiate Petra's marriage with Squall, making sure the cattle sects don't aid them, realizing just how cooked he would be if that happened. This scaredy rat writes a letter to beg for the cattle sects' help. Meanwhile, Pastry counts his never-ending profits and tells Fuel that he'll be using this money from selling sweets and photos to buy 100 goats, milk them, and make cheese to elevate his desserts. Fuel reminds him how they once brought in goats years ago, only for their barren land to run out of grass for them. However, since Pastry is cocky as shit, he believes that won't happen now that he has created water reservoirs. In fact, he wants to extend their horizons and bring in chickens and cows too. The dumb advisor wonders if he wants to eat chicken meat that badly, only for Pastry to double dare him never to touch his precious chickens as they are necessary for eggs, which are in turn needed to prepare cakes and custards, his one true lifeline. After this, he drags this useless guy to another taste testing session and shows him a new kind of vegan sweet syrup he has prepared, which Fuel finds excessively sweet, confirming that Pastry has indeed achieved his goal. Later, he hires Mark and Lumi for yet another session of unpaid labor as they prepare a juicer to extract more of this syrup. Lycoris shows up to annoy them as Lumi struggles to reach for the head of the rod, while Mark body shames her for being too heavy. This gets on her nerves, so as she squeezes his head between her legs, they all trip and fall, breaking the juice's handle in the process. After this failure, Lycoris puts her 2 cents in and explains how they can use something like a wine juicer instead, an idea that Pastry instantly likes. He quickly sprints back home to make his father cater to yet another one of his weird hobbies, only to get a reality check when he comes face to face with him and learns that war has finally broken out. He explains that Hubert's household's neighbors, the Luderouts, have announced they'd be sending their army to whoop the former in a few days, a revelation that scares the out of Pastry. A few days later, as Pastry whips up some sus white cream, his father and his men sweat themselves out during a fan service workout session, speculating whether whipping some cream for hours is a secret new scheme to build muscle. Pastry smirks and shows off his god-gifted buff, explaining how whipping does nothing to develop muscles. In fact, so doesn't his diabetes diet, which lacks all forms of protein. This pisses off Casserole, and he tells him to take his puny health seriously. On the other hand, Luderout's army gathers around in his tent, where they calculate how Hubert must have smelled their claim that an army of 30,000 was total bullshit, and hence, he hasn't called for Cattlesec's army yet. The general suspects that either Cattlesec turned him down when he got tired of cleaning up after his mess, or Hubert got too cocky and never asked for it. Luderout deduces it was the latter since he needs to save his ugly face and ward off an army of merely 10,000 on his own. Just as he wonders how to do so, one of his soldiers brings news that Squall is currently residing in the Hubert household, making him smirk like a part-time devil. On the other hand, while Pastry practices even harder to become the perfect housewife, Lycoris walks into the kitchen and tries to score one with him by mentioning how all wars in the world could have been avoided if everyone loved sweets just as much as Pastry did, because then they'd be too busy fighting diabetes to pull each other's legs. This instantly wins him over, and Pastry tells her he'd be rewarding her with a cheesecake as soon as his long-awaited goats get delivered. Later, however, all his dreams get shattered when his goats get stolen by another swindler who looks like he ate all of them.
Come on, man.
The merchant explains how he was threatened by his men and forced to sell Pastry's goats to him. Casserole states that they would just have to suck it up since the ongoing war is bound to make things a lot worse for them over the next few days. However, Pastry can't bear with it and marches right out to give that shithead a piece of his mind, only to be stopped by Casserole, who reminds him that the Baron did not steal his goats but paid for them, which is why he can't achieve anything, even if he drags his sorry ass to his mansion and cries him a river. Fuel, on the other hand, uses his megamind to suggest that they join Hubert's army as reinforcements to step higher on the provision priority list and get back their goats from the Baron in this way. Casserole likes this idea too, and Pastry gets so fired up that he turns into a Super Saiyan. As their army sets off, Mark whines about how he wanted to go too, only for Lumi to call him a weak-ass loser who would have dragged everyone down. Lycoris, on the other hand, feels upset about Pastry's sudden departure, but he apologizes and says he can't help but choose his precious goats over her flat ass. On the other hand, Squall sets the highest simping record as he thirsts after Petra's portrait and later her rainbow-like appearance. That's when Hubert walks in on them and teases Squall about how much his ladykiller skills have improved, only for their fun family time to be ruined by the Greek god, who barges in and informs Hubert of the upcoming Luderout army. On the bright side though, when he learns that it's only 10,000 people, he believes his army can take them and tells Squall to get ready to finally become a man and lead one of his units to the front line. Since this sissy has never stepped onto the battlefield before, he almost shit his pants, only to agree when he realizes he can impress Petra with the riz of an army guy. Meanwhile, the cunning shark-toothed bastard plans to tear the Huberts and Cattlesecks apart by attacking Squall, whom he expects to be on the battlefield. At the same time, Squall heads to the battlefield dressed like a Gucci model and holds on to Petra's photograph. A few hours later, Pastry and Casserole arrive at Hubert's mansion, and while discussing his battle plan, Casserole feels as if something is off about the enemy's formation, only that his dimwit can't tell what. Pastry uses the power of the make to magically understand it and explain how the enemies, who should be getting ready to mount an attack, are in a defensive position. This helps Casserole explain how if he were the mastermind, he'd use smaller units to land multiple ambushes on the enemy, especially their first line unit. That's when Hubert realizes that his shit battle ick failed to sense this, and he unknowingly sent Squall to the perfect ambush spot. Hearing this, Casserole and Pastry immediately rush out to rescue his weak, sorry existence. Meanwhile, just as Squall charges into the enemy territory, Luderout's forces completely surround his army, and Squall realizes he's as good as smoked meat now. His men ask him for orders, and he eventually tells them to retreat, only to realize that the option is outdated now and that his only choice is to fight. However, just before he rushes in with his dimwit and measly muscles, Casserole and his men ravage the battlefield, and Pastry shows up to rescue Squall right before he bursts into tears. Once the battle is over and Squall has been rescued, he stands hand in hand with Pastry, like star-crossed lovers, and expresses gratitude, only to be left horrified by the sight of all the soldiers that have fallen because of him. Meanwhile, Luderout bites his lips as he sourly accepts defeat after learning that the cunning Hubert has tamed a battle beast like Casserole. On the other hand, as Squall returns home, Hubert feels glad he didn't accidentally widow his daughter, and says he'll forever stay in Pastry's debt. Both he and his father lie about how heroic Squall was on the battlefield, but since he knows he was nothing but a weak-ass skunk, he takes his leave to rest his head. Just then, Petra shows up, all sick with concern, only to be shut out by Squall's self-pity as he tells her he needs to be alone. Seeing him crushed so badly under the weight of defeat, Petra worries about how this is the first time she has seen him doing anything besides fangirling for her and wonders what she can do to help, being as useless as she is. Casserole turns to Pastry and reminds him how he pulled Mark out of depression once and wonders if he can do the same for Squall. This makes him wonder what in the world he can achieve with his flat ass that Petra cannot, even with her massive plot cannons, only to be reminded of what Lycoris said. He realizes that sweets are always better than bitches, and with this, he gets down to bake yet another culinary masterpiece. Soon enough, while Hubert throws a massive celebration party and Squall sulks throughout it, Pastry kneads his dough and butters up his apples to create the perfect dessert. Seeing how ugly the missus looks, Casserole tries to pep talk him into feeling proud of his lousy self. only for him to be reminded, again and again, of the bloodshed. Just then, Pastry shows up and rubs salt into Squall's already insecure ass by buttering up his stupid father-in-law. However, he forgets all about his insignificance as soon as Pastry unveils his tart tatin and hands a plate to Squall, explaining how this dish is inspired by his world-class failure. When Squall doesn't get it, he explains that this dish was a failed version of an apple pie, which came into existence because the creator forgot to spread the crust at the bottom and had to place it on top of the apples. This does more damage than help as Squall starts feeling even more shitty, only for Pastry to explain how one failure can bring about miracles as beautiful as a tart tatin, which is why he shouldn't mull over his own. This reminds Squall of his family traumas and how he was always lectured about never failing. This is when Petra steps in and tells him she's nothing but proud of him to return home safe, whether it was over 100 innocent corpses. Her talk no jutsu finally gets through to him, and he promises to become a better leader in the future before ignoring Pastry, his real savior, and inviting the ugly bitch to have a drink with him in the garden. Later, Pastry returns home with all the gifts he hoarded from dumb Hubark and informs Fuel how his father has stayed behind with the Duke to buy back all his stolen goats and to ruin whatever's left of the swindling Baron. Seeing his freaky expression sends chills down Cinderella's spine just as Casserole returns. He takes Pastry away to help him teleport all the animals he has won back, only for Fuel to discover he has practically brought in an entire zoo to their poor, small village. The sadist further reveals how he's pulled one on the Baron by buying the horses he paid an advance sum for just so he would go through the same humiliation. Following this, Pastry successfully creates a wine squasher to produce his sweet syrup and even goes out with Licorice on a date to the capital, while Rites can't help but fume over Pastry's audacity and simp after his Riz at the same time. A few days later, he finally keeps his promise to Licorice and bakes her a cheesecake, which she can't help but absolutely adore. This brings us to the end of Pastry's sweet adventures. Thanks for sticking around till the end, you absolute legend. Let's confuse the fake fans by commenting "RIP Pastry" down below. Meanwhile, click on the screen to watch some of our other videos. Until next time, stay awesome, stay AniGeek.